Good day, dear participants. My name is Anastasia Malygina. I'm Associate Professor at St. Petersburg University. I'm glad to welcome you to the third day of the Forum of Knowledge, which is hosted by the Presidential Library and St. Petersburg State University. The Forum of Knowledge is an all-Russian academic and educational project of the Presidential Library. It consists of a series of events held over several days in September each year. This year, the topic of the forum is the global challenges in the digital age. Before I give the floor to the moderator and ask him to introduce our excellent speakers and commentators, let me say a few words about the agenda and the way how we will work today. Here at the table with me, you can see the students and graduates of the Strategic and Arms Control Studies Master's Program at St. Petersburg State University. And we have online superb experts and analysts who have kindly agreed to join us and discuss the evolution of the threat of nuclear war in times of growing multipolarity. The two keynote speakers and commentators will help us to cover the full spectrum of geopolitical, technical, and humanitarian aspects of the topic. This panel is broadcasted online, and the record will be available on the YouTube channel of the library and the official webpage of the Presidential Library. Our discussion will be in English, but the simultaneous translation is available for those who would like to listen to the discussion in Russian. So, those who watch us online can choose between two windows on YouTube and listen either in English or in Russian with simultaneous translation. You can put questions either in Russian or in English in the chat box of the YouTube channel, and my assistants will help me to collect the questions. I will also collect the questions from the audience here at the table with me. So I will help the distinguished moderator to collect questions and give these questions to the speakers and the commentators. Let me now introduce the moderator of the discussion, Ambassador Sergey Batsanov, who is the member of the advisory board of the Strategic and Arms Control Studies Master Program at St. Petersburg State University. Ambassador Batsanov, good day. Ambassador Batsanov worked on the whole range of arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation issues in the Soviet and later Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 1989-1993, he was leading the Soviet, then Russian delegations to the Conference on Disarmament. He participated in a number of US-Soviet ministerials and summits and in numerous sessions of the UN General Assembly and other UN bodies. Ambassador Batsanov participated in a number of disarmament treaties review conferences, such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Biological Weapons Convention, and the Chemical Weapons Convention review conferences. Sergey Batsanov is the member of Pugwash Council of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs. In Pugwash, Ambassador Batsanov is dealing with issues of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, biosecurity, and strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention regime, as well as the issues related to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Ambassador Batsanov is particularly active in Track 2 diplomacy. He is also the member of European Leadership Network, the senior member of European Leadership Network, which is an independent pan-European network that unites nearly 200 past, present, and future European leaders working together to provide practical, real-world solution to political and security challenges. I'm really delighted to have such brilliant speakers and commentators and such brilliant moderator here with us today. So, Ambassador Batsanov, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for introduction, Professor Malygina. And it's indeed a great pleasure and honor for me to be able to participate in this, I would say, rather groundbreaking event. Although, for those who may not be aware, the Forum of Knowledge, the event in which we are now having the third day, has been organized by the Presidential Library now for 5 years, so it's a kind of university. This year, the program and the contact are the result of a partnership between the library and the St. Petersburg State University. And as someone who also participated a little bit in the creation of the program and content, I would express the hope that it would allow this event to kind of raise to the next step or level. So, as Professor Malygina already said, we are here now to discuss the evolution of the threat of nuclear war. And I would, before introducing the keynote speakers and other participants, I would like to maybe say a couple of words without stealing too much time from the discussion. The threat of nuclear war is, of course, with us ever since nuclear weapons came into existence, and that was in 1945. Without doubt, it is probably one of the most catastrophic risks since that time, if you compare it to other risks that may be equally catastrophic, such as a collision between the planet Earth and a gigantic meteorite, I think it is really more real. We are living under this risk for many, many years. We lived through various crises, which well, maybe a bit belatedly, but not tragically belatedly, allowed the key countries and actually people around the world to understand what nuclear war would really mean and what should be done in order to prevent it. Among these crises, I mean, first of all, the Caribbean crisis, the Caribbean Missile Crisis in 1962. Then we lived through the rest of the Cold War, through the end of the Cold War, and it seemed to many, to me including myself, that the risk of nuclear calamity was reducing, and that the efforts undertaken during the Cold War, especially at its end, were beginning to give positive results. However, something did not work. And you know, the doomsday clock that is controlled by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in the United States, which shows the danger of nuclear war in terms of number of minutes and seconds that remain or may remain before a nuclear catastrophe breaks out. So recently, the clock was moved very close to midnight, only 100 seconds remaining, which means that at least that part of the international community believes that the risks of nuclear war and the use of nuclear weapons are on the rise. We need to understand, first of all, is it really so? Maybe not. But if so, why? What are the reasons for that? And after that, what, if we manage to understand, what we should do to address the problem and look for solutions. So why, if so? Is it because new technologies are coming into our life, including into the military sphere? And here we need to address not only the technologies directly related to nuclear weapons and their means of delivery, but also other spectrum, the whole spectrum of technologies that may have influence on the nuclear risks. Or maybe it's relations, changing relations, evolving relations among states. And here we come to what in Russia is often called movement towards multipolarity, what in some other countries is called differently, like major power rivalry or competition. It's a more energetic term, but the fact remains that in the last maybe 30 years, there has been accelerating one of that, a major redistribution of global economic power. And after that, no surprise, it is followed by the redistribution of global political power and other elements, key elements of international relations. So is that the reason? Or maybe there is some combination of these two things, or maybe there are certain changes in societal attitudes. Indeed, nuclear weapons now are at a rather low level, or if not the lowest, compared to what we observed in the 1960s or 1970s and first half of 1980s. So the numbers are down, the risk is up. Is it credible or not? There are different solutions being proposed. Some are radical, and important groups and movements, and indeed impressive number of states believe that we just should abolish, prohibit nuclear weapons, and maybe the rest would sort itself out automatically after that. Others believe that no, you need to, let's say, use the existing, but some of them are becoming old, existing international mechanisms, and develop new ones and move kind of step by step, taking into account the new developments. Where is, again, the truth? This is another question. And the last point that I would like to throw into discussion. In earlier days, when the nuclear risks were on the rise, civil society in many countries across the globe, in different forms, of course, played a very important role, instrumental role, in pushing the governments concerned towards talking more to each other, towards inventing compromise solutions or approaches, and in many other ways was contributing to the correct realization of the dangers and risks of those days. Now it seems, and again, it's a question whether, when I'm claiming that, whether I am right or wrong. Now it seems that civil society is much more preoccupied with the consequences of climate change and how to deal with that, and several other issues, but not necessarily with the nuclear risks. A small, very professional part of the civil society, yes, they are dealing with it, they are concerned with it, but civil society in large, maybe not so much anymore. So for that reason, well, I'm using this as a kind of a bridge to start inviting our speakers to take the floor. The first speaker is us from the Netherlands. Let me introduce him, and maybe I would then introduce other speakers as they would be invited to take the floor. So Peter is a medical doctor who had a long and outstanding career in this profession, starting as a family doctor, a very key role, at least in the Dutch medical and health care system, on which, I mean, the position, a lot of things depend. And then became occupational doctor, also very important. Was Consul General of the Royal Dutch Medical Organization, has several high decorations of the Dutch state, including by the Dutch king. And after retirement, he became active in social movements against nuclear war. He may talk a little bit more why that happened. To him, he initiated movement against neutron weapons, rather, and against nuclear arms race in Europe in early mid-1980s in Holland. He is the chair of the Dutch chapter of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which we in Russia used to call Врачи мира за предотвращение ядерной войны, which was a famous movement again in early 1980s, mid-80s. And he is also, Peter Bart, the chair of coalition of several Dutch non-governmental organizations for nuclear-free world, and actively works together with his partners in that coalition with his government and political parties, organizes protests at the Fokker military air base, where a certain number of US nuclear war bombs are being stored. So he's doing actually a lot of very various things in this area. With that, Peter, you have the floor. Perhaps I should say, please unmute yourself. And the next would be Dmitry. The next would be after Peter finishes, Dmitry Stepanovich. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Bazanov. After this introduction, I'm afraid it can only be a disappointment, having such high expectations, but I will try to meet them and start with saying spasiba to you and all the other organizers of this important forum of knowledge, knowledge we desperately need to solve some of the world's biggest problems and challenges. And one of them, COVID-19, made it unfortunately impossible to be in your city now, your wonderful city of St. Petersburg, which I visited in 1995. And I fell in love immediately. No wonder for somebody from Amsterdam, knowing that Peter the Great, about his invitation to Dutch architects to build the canal part of the city and the treasure of the Dutch paintings in the Hermitage, combined with the wonderful music those days, and now also in the Mariinsky Theater by my friend and your citizen Valery Gergiev. What a pity I could not be there. Well, before I start, Mr. Chair, allow me that I cannot start my presentation without having first said 3 times Spasiba from the bottom of my heart to your country, if you allow me. In the first place, for the unimaginable courage and suffering of your people to conquer the Nazi fascism in World War II. Stalingrad, Moscow, and this city marked the turning point, but the price was very high, estimated 23 million of deaths, unimaginable. More cheerful is my spasiba for the wonderful music coming from your country. Composers from Tchaikovsky to Shostakovich, and the amazing amount of performers, violinists, pianists, sopranos, whatever. We have in Holland heard so many of them. It's unbelievable. Thank you for that. And the last point, and the connection with the theme of today, is I would say spasiba for the braveness of the men who really saved the world, saved all our lives, because we were not here if Soviet army colonels Stanislav Petrov didn't handle a crisis, a nuclear crisis, on the 26th of September 83 near Moscow, where incoming nuclear missiles from the US, supposed, he handled it in a way that he distrusted that it was really true, and he was right. After 50 minutes of an ordeal in his compound, it turned out to be a computer mistake. And here we are really in the heart of the matter and the danger we are discussing today. And like Ambassador Bazanov and many others, I have always thought for years that since the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons were not a problem anymore. But since my retirement in 2015, I was in a position to acquire knowledge about the unbelievable risk we are exposed to every day, and how many times we hardly escaped. The Cuba crisis already mentioned, also a sheer luck that we didn't run a nuclear war, said afterwards McNamara, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense. And well, the experts say it's not a question if, but it's only the question when things will go terribly wrong. So in one line, we are defending ourselves by weapons that any moment could cause the end of us and the end of the whole civilization. Now I'm at the least of it, I'm not a pessimistic man, I'm quite optimistic. So that's the reason I raised this issue in 2014 in my board of to say, what can we do? What can we do in this country, little country, and how can we bring this issue, nuclear weapons, back on the agenda, the political agenda, the public agenda? So we started with first to create a solid base in Dutch medical community, because we are physicians. Well, I wrote a medical appeal, and it's still the base of our activity. So I read a part of it, the main part of it. It's 2015, 70 years after 2 devastating nuclear bombs on Japan, which caused 250,000 deaths. The world still harbors 16,000 nuclear weapons those days, which are up to 1,000 times, 1,000 times more powerful than those that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Many are hair-triggered, and billions of dollars are being spent on modernization. The signatories of this appeal, who work in Dutch healthcare, strongly support the UN call to eliminate nuclear weapons completely. The medical, humanitarian, and infrastructural consequences are so disastrous that we will not able to offer any substantial medical help. Healthcare professionals will be victims too. Meanwhile, important research shows that even a small regional nuclear conflict will result in a nuclear famine, potentially causing up to 2 billion deaths because of hunger, because of massive crop failures. And moreover, near nuclear weapon accidents by technical failure or human error have already brought us near the nuclear abyss several times. So therefore, we call for prevention. Don't let these weapons of mass destruction be used, either by purpose or by accident. Elimination, as called upon by the UN, is the ultimate preventive measure, and a ban on nuclear weapons would be a big step forward. So we start collecting signatures in the medical community. Our expectancy was not high, but to our surprise, many so-called top docs in Dutch healthcare were eager to sign up, and in no time we had hundreds of directors and heads of this, heads of that, very leading figures. And so we presented this appeal to the general public in the Bali, the famous Dutch place for public debate. It was published in the British Medical Journal, the important scientific journal. We presented it to Parliament, and it was received there very seriously, much more than we expected, and it led to a resolution with a majority in Parliament asking the government, that was reluctant to do so, but to join the negotiations about a ban treaty in the UN in New York. As the only NATO country we did, and it was argumented by this medical appeal. So we then were energized to take next steps. So we had another event in that Bali debate center, inviting potential allies like the Red Cross, like Mayors for Peace, like the peace movement PAX and others to speak there. And for the first time also people from the churches and from humanistic organizations. And afterwards we invited them to join us in a coalition, civil society coalition for a nuclear weapon-free world called the Bali Barat. Where now, since this year, also officially the Council of Churches of Holland is joining, PUKWAS is joining, and other civil society organizations, making it able to make a clear voice to Dutch politics, to parliament, to government, what we are aiming at. And we did that by writing civil society appeals, by organizing, when we are writing op-eds, by organizing public events, manifestations. And one of them in 2017, on the day of total abolition of nuclear weapons, 26th of September, devoted to Stanislav Petrov by the UN to honor this man. We had another event during the negotiations for a new coalition in Holland, and it turned out to be a right-wing, center-right-wing coalition. But when it some weeks later made clear what they were up to, we were again surprised that for the first time ever in a declaration, a starting declaration of a government, this government says, we actively pursue a nuclear weapon-free world. Well, that was an opening for us to raise the pressure, and we did in several ways. Too much to tell about in the short period of time I am allowed to now to speak. One of them I will mention, because of our good relations with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we were invited by the main Dutch advisory body on international relations about the Netherlands and the future of nuclear weapons. It is chaired by the former NATO Secretary General De Hoop Scheffer. And we were invited to give our view on this issue, which we of course did. And then a stagnation appeared in bringing out this advice. It took much longer, and we heard later on that it was because of our medical humanitarian arguments that had to be incorporated in what was expected to be an easygoing pro-nuclear weapon advice. And it ended with saying that never, ever a nuclear detonation should happen. But on the other hand, it said we have to build, we need credible nuclear deterrence. So when I met the Hoop Scheffer some weeks later, I made compliments for at first place the urgency of the issue, and the second place that they advised that the Dutch take the lead in taking initiative to discuss how to prevent nuclear war in UN, in Europe, directly with Russia, and to have a dialogue with your country. And I said, by one problem, I say, you cannot say never ever a nuclear weapon should be detonated because of the devastating medical humanitarian consequences. And at the same page saying, we have to have a credible nuclear deterrence, because that can only mean that the adversary, whoever that may be, must be sure that we will use it. And that's, yeah, he said, yes, that is a contradiction we cannot solve. Well, I said, as a medical doctor, I think we are obliged, and as a citizen of this world, we have to get out of this paradox. We have to find ways to build up, to change this mutual assured deterrence theory, let it to belong to the 20th century, and let make sensible people create another way of dealing with each other without nuclear weapons. Well, this paradox appeared also in the reaction of the governmental of the government, and we, of course, and we were invited by Parliament to discuss this. We made a position paper about this, giving our arguments. This discussion is still going on, but it was clear with another civil society appeal that we had a direct influence on Parliament, because the lines of that appeal, signed up with 111 illustrious Dutch citizens, it was taken over by Parliament, and in a resolution that asked from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to directly confront the nuclear powers with their obligations under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and to take the initiative to start pressure on real nuclear disarmament. Although the trend is the other way around, like Ambassador already said. Well, a lot more is to be told about this. I skipped the, behind me you see the Peace Palace in The Hague, where we had to celebrate our 50th anniversary together with the government, the Dutch government. Minister of Foreign Affairs Blok spoke there, and 80% of his speech we could easily copy in a manifesto from us, because it really shifting the Dutch position, not as much as we want, but we really had used, it makes sense to raise our voice. I also met there as a speaker in the Peace Palace, Ambassador Bazanov, a starting of a good friendship, I would say, and I very much appreciate his knowledge, and I hope that Russia and the rest of the world take advantage of that knowledge. I have to come to an end before Ambassador is warning me. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from this way we started civil society movement in Holland, not alone, together with our allies in the so-called Bali Barat. But we discovered that raising our medical voice had a very special effect on Dutch politics, because I have to admit that we belong to the few people who are being listened to, not suspected of giving fake news, or we have a position of trust when we have no other interest than the health of the people, and we are obliged by our oath of Hippocrates to take a stand when there is a big risk for the health of actually the global population. And our international organization had the same arguments in the 80s, the early 80s, and they were so powerful that they convinced Reagan and Gorbachev. They admitted afterwards fully that it were the medical arguments that give them the final push to go reluctantly to the table and there to start negotiations led to bringing down the nuclear arsenals from 60,000 to the current, let's say, 13,000. So it's possible, very much possible to bring it down, but we have to find ways to finish the job, and I hope this forum of knowledge will contribute to really save humanity. I'm convinced as a medical doctor of that. It's time to act. Спасибо.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bas. I would perhaps suggest, maybe it would allow to save some time, that I would give the floor now to Dmitry Stepanovich. After that, we may have questions to both of them, but if not, we would start discussion with the participation of our discussants, whom I would then introduce in any case. And Dmitry Stepanovich is a research fellow at the Center of International Security of one of Russian leading think tanks or academic institutions, if you wish. It's called Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Now it's named after Evgeny Primakov, who used to be director there. He's also a non-resident fellow of another quite prestigious, I would say, and extremely well-qualified research center, Institute of Peace Research of University of Hamburg in Germany. And he is also doing regular consultancy work for the United Nations and its various agencies, CIPRI, but we would hear CIPRI a bit later on, from CIPRI, European Leadership Network, IISS, well, basically the US think tank. And I met him late last year, that is before coronavirus, at an interesting seminar workshop that Pagos organized on hypersonic weapons and weapon systems. I, at that time, greatly appreciated his knowledge and ability to connect different things and sharpness at the same time. So I'm very happy, Dmitry, that you agreed to participate in our discussion. The only request I have to you is please sometimes look at your watch or if you have a clock in front of you. So the floor is yours. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Sergey Borisovich and thank Anastasia and everyone for an opportunity to be here. I find such projects very important for greater security on a global scale. I'd like to draw our attention back to the name of the session we are having here today, the evolution of the threat of nuclear war in the growing multipolarity. First, I like that we use the word evolution, because what we witness today around us is evolving global military political relations architecture. Of course, with a taste of nukes, because those remain an important, if not crucial, part of this architecture. But I want to emphasize that it is evolution of the dynamics that were already in place for decades. Next words are also important: threat of nuclear war, or sometimes people use nuclear war risks. There might be different definitions, but nevertheless, there are two parts of this problem. There are risks of inadvertent escalation or accidental nuclear use, but also there is a possibility of actual direct and indirect threats of nuclear use by this or that countries for this or that ends. And now, the multipolarity. Well, actually, back in the days of Cold War, despite the fact that the essence of nuclear relations was based on the dynamics between Moscow and Washington and their allies, still there were some less publicized but tractions, for example, between other nuclear states. For example, between Russia, between the USSR and China at the Far East, there were border conflicts, and that border conflicts involved nuclear weapon states. Then there were some Middle East crises involving different nuclear armed nations, extra-regional nuclear armed nations with their own agendas. So my point is that in the essence, the nuclear risks have been multipolar for quite a while already. But again, today we have, on the one hand, growing number of nuclear weapon states. We have 9 official and unofficial nuclear weapon states. On the other hand, we have overall deterioration of security in different regions and on a global scale. What can we do about it? Well, actually not much, but the recipes of what can be done are rather well known, but though of course complicated. First, we need to rebuild confidence and avoid escalatory behavior and doctrines. All countries might be interested in that. There is an obvious lack of trust between the states, especially not especially, but also in the nuclear domain, which is a bit different from what we achieved back in the late 80s and 90s. And the worst of all, the sides, all nuclear nations, they keep talking past each other. They do not hear each other. There is a notable exception of the P5 format, which is important, which can achieve something, but its effect, unfortunately, is still fairly limited. And it is hard to achieve anything substantial when you simply do not believe what your partner or adversary or competitor, the names doesn't matter in that regard, if you don't believe him, or you always believe or look for some hidden agenda in any of their proposals. We need a shift in the attitude. And if this shift of the attitude is achieved, then we can find arms control solutions. And I must emphasize that arms control is not the end in itself. It's basically a tool of national security, because its ultimate goal is to limit the number and the quality of weapons aimed at your country. So this means that, and by enhancing national security, effectively you can reach a greater international security. Also, arms control is not always hard, like those very good, very important treaties that were signed between the USSR and the United States of America, then signed between Russia and the US with intrusive verification and so on. These things are very important and they're useful, and we must preserve them and continue this trend. But also arms control can be soft. There can be unilateral measures, agreed understandings, unilateral statements, joint statements. These things also contribute to make the situation manageable. But also, arms control is not only about disarmament. First of all, you start with transparency, then go to some limits, some verification measures, then you reduce stuff, and if we are lucky enough, we can talk about proper disarmament. And with that, I'll emphasize that even in the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Article 6 speaks not only about nuclear disarmament, but also about total universal disarmament. Because even without nuclear weapons, the humankind demonstrated that we are quite capable of destroying each other on a great scale, even without nuclear weapons. But how do we find solutions for a multipolar world? Well, first of all, we need to find a regime where no one will believe that their security is undermined. I must emphasize that, speaking about nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads are important, but delivery vehicles for these nuclear warheads are also as important. And probably one rather achievable step would to get some kind of universal regime, akin to something like the Hague Code of Conduct on ballistic missiles, that will provide for a framework for notifications about test launches and probably about the numbers, the arsenals. It won't become a magic pill, but it will provide us a ground for practical cooperation. And my last part is about so-called emerging and disruptive technologies, because we speak about digitalization and changing world. I'd put it straight. There are a lot of fancy and fun developments in this area, including the hypersonic weapons, which are my favorite, as Ambassador Batsanov mentioned. But again, it is also evolutionary, not revolutionary capability. There is cyberspace with growing connection to the electronic warfare. There is outer space, there is artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons. And those things affect both offensive and defensive capabilities. Moreover, all of these assets need substantial supportive infrastructure, like ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, command control communications, networks, all this stuff. So we talk about systems of systems rather than standalone capabilities. And such complex nature of these developments results into some kind of seamless warfighting domains, which is, some people might find a good thing, others may find a bad thing, but the issue is that offensive and defensive, kinetic and non-kinetic, nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities are entangled and can be attacked from any direction. It's next to impossible to reach an agreement on which developments, which things are actually destabilizing or stabilizing, but we need to find a way to be transparent about intentions. Without trust, there will be limited success. And, military planners always think about capabilities rather than doctrines, but at least we should try to first to explain the reasons and goals of the development of this or that technology and fielding of it, but also hear what others say about their perceptions of their technologies. And that I'll stop and invite everyone to have a fruitful discussion.
Dmitry, thank you a lot. Am I being heard? Thank you. Thank you a lot. I frankly realized that when I started my previous intervention, so to say, thanking Peter Bart, I had in mind to say a couple of things, quite short, and I also need to correct myself on a mistake I made, but that was related to Dmitry's introduction. So I was also very touched, Peter Bart, by your several thanks to my country. And also in particular, the one where you referred to the Second World War. And you mentioned Leningrad, you mentioned Stalingrad. This is a knowledge, a kind of knowledge that is with us. And I think it is very important. And I think we cannot allow ourselves to have this knowledge diluted, not to say forgotten or perverted. This is just a remark, a general remark. And my mistake was, or rather slip of the tongue, that I think I said that IISS was a US think tank. Of course, it is a British one. So, but with an important outlet in Washington anyway. And I was thinking about a friend in that at that specific moment who happened to work in Washington rather than in London. Anyway, now we have, I have a question to Professor Maligina. Do we have any questions collected? Or, if not, I would then ask for comments from our commenters. But before I do so, let me introduce them. And they are Dr. Pyotr Topichkanov, who is now senior researcher in SIPRI, Stockholm Peace Research, International Peace Research Institute, in the program on nuclear disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. Before that, he was fellow at Carnegie's Moscow Center non-proliferation program, and also at the same time senior researcher in the same IMEMO, which I've already introduced via Dr. Stepanovich. And he is also an expert at the Russian International Affairs Council, also a think tank in Moscow. Another discussant that we have is Andrei Baklitsky, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Center of Euro-Atlantic Security at not IMEMO, but MGIMO. Please correct me if I make a mistake or something. At MGIMO University, consultant at the Peer Center, another non-governmental think tank, and of course MGIMO University is not a non-governmental real institution, it is under the Foreign Ministry. He is also a member of the Deep Cuts Commission, which is brainstorming the question of how to do the deep cuts of nuclear weapons, and an expert of a quite prestigious Russian discussion forum, which is called Valdai Council. And then we have Nadezhda Kulibaba, who I think should be next to Professor Malygina, and please raise your hand, Nadia. Well, okay. She is a PhD student at St. Petersburg University. She is interested in nuclear non-proliferation, arms control, nuclear risk reduction. She already worked in some or another way in various Russian institutions, including the outlet of the Ministry of Foreign Relations in St. Petersburg. These are our three discussants. And perhaps I would like to start with Pyotr Topichkanov, whether you have comments. We have, I think, about 1 hour remaining for our panel, and I would ask, of course, everyone to keep that in mind. Pyotr, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Sergey Borisovich. It's my pleasure to be today at this event, and I fully support the words mentioned before me about how important these discussions are to not necessarily to save the world, but at least to find solutions how to avoid nuclear risks and challenges. I'm so grateful to the panelists, if I may, to Peter and to Dmitry for their remarks and highlights about the nuclear risks and solutions. And in response, because there are a lot of things have been mentioned by them, it's quite difficult to react to everything. That is why I would choose several points I would like to highlight in my response. First of all, I would like to say that it's interesting that covering the issues of nuclear risks and challenges from the humanitarian point of view and from the technical and political point of view, Peter and Dmitry didn't mention the TPNW and the campaign leading to this treaty and this role of this treaty. So this is my question probably for you. What is your vision of this treaty, and is it significant in terms of contributing into the disarmament process, or at least into the reducing the nuclear risks? And as for my own take on this, I would say that there are a lot of problems with this treaty and with this movement, but I am personally feeling appreciation for the raising humanitarian aspects of nuclear disarmament and nuclear weapons with this campaign leading to the TPNW. And I think that the pressure on the nuclear weapon states by this movement and by this treaty is quite important and helpful to provoke further discussions between nuclear weapon states about how to proceed with their commitments under the Article 6 of the NPT, and how to save the NPT treaty, and how to have some measures agreed between them about reducing nuclear risks. And so somehow indirectly it might help them to go further with the doctrinal dialogue and the different frameworks, including the P5 discussions. Also, I was grateful to hear from Peter about the paradox existing between the mutual assured deterrence and the need to disarm and the need to go lower in terms of nuclear arsenals to the point of nuclear zero. And I would like to add another paradox. Somehow the development of non-nuclear strategic systems may help to avoid the focus on nuclear weapons when securing deterrence and security goals, because somehow these strategic weapons without nuclear warheads may substitute, and already they substitute the role of nuclear weapons in terms of high precision, in terms of effective use in some conflicts. But there is another side of this story, that the development of these systems may convince nuclear weapon states that they need to have nuclear weapons, because the nuclear weapons are the security guarantee for them, that they are not targeted by these non-nuclear strategic weapons. What do you think about this dilemma and this paradox? Is it helpful that the nuclear weapon states develop non-nuclear strategic weapons, or this creates another obstacle for the nuclear disarmament? And as for my last point, I would like to highlight you mentioned several frameworks, including the humanitarian organizations and campaigns, including UN, international, bilateral, and other frameworks. For me, the question is what the institute, what the platform is the most effective in terms of promote the disarmament ideas. And of course, I feel, of course, I was too young in 1980s to be a part of disarmament campaigns, but learning from the books and hearing from participants like you, Peter, I understand that at that time it was very active campaign, and it was a very active and multinational effort to explain to the leadership in different countries that nuclear weapons is a big danger for the world and for the people. And if to compare with the current days campaigns and efforts, even if they are effective somehow, because they could lead to the TPNW, as an example, now we can see that they're not so significant in terms of explaining to the leadership about nuclear weapons and their dangers. So for me, the question is how to build the bridges between the experience in the past, the public campaigns now, and the decision-making process about nuclear weapons and disarmament and arms control. How to make these bridges working in two directions. When the leaders believe that they need to explain, to provide transparent arguments about their goals and disarmament commitments, and when the public has influence on the decisions of the political and military leaders. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you very much, Petr Vladimirovich. I think I would suggest that we go straight ahead to Andrei Alexandrovich Bakritsky, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Batsanov. Does anybody hear me? Yes, great. Thank you, Ambassador Batsanov, for your kind introduction, and to St. Petersburg State University and Presidential Library for inviting me. I would probably start by saying that we should just leave it to Dr. Baus and his colleagues in our respective countries to deal with the issue, and it'll be probably more successful than whatever we, as self-proclaimed nuclear weapons experts, are all doing here. But still, I'll try to add a couple of points, mainly reacting to what Dmitry said about how do we move from a precarious situation we are now to maybe something better. And I totally agree with Dmitry that we need to rebuild confidence and trust. But the bad news would be that it would be really hard or even impossible to reestablish full trust between Russia and the United States in the short term. And also, if you look at the relationship between other nuclear weapon states like China and US, for example, we don't see that kind of distrust we see between Moscow and Washington, which oftentimes come from the angle of one side cheating or being accused of cheating, but rather from the general feeling that the other side is engaged with you in a broader competition, which I'm not sure you can really address in purely nuclear weapon context. So if you're China, you just don't believe that whatever US is doing is in your best interest and vice versa. So that's the bad news. The good news is that I would argue that it's not necessary maybe to have this full trust and confidence, because again, if you're talking about nuclear weapons issues, specialists in charge have a pretty decent understanding on who does what, and even if there are some disagreements or specific interpretations, that's surmountable. Frankly, and I probably be a contrarian here, I don't think there are any unsurmountable difficulties for having effective arms control today. We have been doing this before in much dire circumstances, I would argue, and we managed it to happen. I would say that the bigger problem currently is the lack of interest on the part of political elites towards nuclear arms control, nuclear issues, or if they have some interest, it's completely transactional and it's packed into their bigger priorities, and you can just easily sacrifice nuclear arms control if that's something you're willing to do in your bigger game. So before we have this political interest, which can lead us to new negotiations, maybe having new treaties, and we can discuss what kind of treaties it could be. They could be different from something we're having now. But before we get there, we should probably focus on trying not to get ourselves killed in a nuclear war, which might include transparency, which might include better communications, but that would be for slightly different reasons than Dmitry suggested. And maybe with more self-interest in mind. We shouldn't be trying to use transparency to build the ground for arms control. We should just try to make sure that as long as we are not in this next phase of arms control talks, just stay safe there. Then, of course, there is a problem of some countries actually using some kind of nuclear unpredictability or opacity to enhance their security or to do what they believe enhance their security. But that's slightly a different question, but the one we can probably also discuss during our discussion today. And I leave it here.
Well, thank you very much. And now I'm looking at the table with Professor Malygina and her colleagues, trying to understand if our third discussant wants to say something at this point.
Yes, Sergey Borisovich, thank you for giving us the floor. I guess now I will give the floor to Nadezhda. Nadezhda, please push the button and the floor is yours.
So good day to everyone, and I also would like to thank our brilliant speakers for their brilliant presentations. And I think that my comment will be more relevant to Dr. Baus' presentation. Well, while writing my master thesis, I found out that the concept of nuclear threat wasn't, let's say, created artificially by the politician or by the militaries. So the concept was born and later developed within the epistemic community, within the joint work of experts and officials. And also different parts of the society were involved. For example, I'm speaking about the church, about the Catholic Church, which, if I'm not mistaken, in 1980s became the platform for discussion for Soviet and American experts, so they could discuss different issues related to nuclear deterrence, to nuclear arms control, and I'm speaking about the Pontifical Academy of Science. And here comes the question why the Cold War policy of nuclear threat reduction was less successful. And I think we can say that it was successful, at least because nuclear collision didn't happen. And I think that it was successful because of the multi-level dialogue. And under multi-level dialogue, I understand the dialogue not only on a political level, but the dialogue also on expert level and the domestic dialogue. So dialogue between domestic experts and domestic officials. So this allowed to develop new ideas. So the epistemic community was a kind of source for new ideas, for new visions, and these ideas were later implemented on the political level. And nowadays, when it always said that we need to look for new ideas, for new approaches, I think that we can address the experience of the Cold War times. So nowadays, we also can look for new ideas within the epistemic communities, within the experts, and such forums as ours today is, I think it's a great way to find these new approaches. And I also have a small question for Dmitry Stepanovich, so I think I can ask it now. Well, Dmitry used a very interesting term of soft and hard arms control, and I would like to ask you, are these terms applicable to explain the challenges in current US-Russia arms control? So maybe Russian approach is a kind of hard arms control when Russian side wants to have strict agreements and for the American side, for example, let's say gentlemen agreements, okay. So I will stop here, I think.
I guess, Dmitry, it's now over to you. Could you please answer Nadezhda's question, and then maybe, if I'm permitted, I will open the floor to other questions that I have collected.
Sure, I'd love to answer Nadezhda's question and probably make a few comments on what was said by Peter and Andrei, if it's okay. Yep, I think Nadezhda is absolutely right. To some extent, this separation between hard and soft arms control might be related to Russian and US attitude on the existing arms control architecture between the bilateral arms control architecture. But I must emphasize that while official position is rather hard on the Russian side, sorry for using the same word, actually, there are signs that there might be some flexibility. For example, there was this leaked document sent by the, I think, Russian MFA or Russian embassy in Washington to the US Congress explaining Russian attitude towards this or that challenges of New START, where, well, it was mentioned that Russia might be okay with so-called politically binding agreements. Not legally binding, but politically binding agreements to solve some of the issues, although explicitly related to New START, which is obviously an example of hard arms control. But again, I believe that some flexibility must be a part of the approach to this problem, because it is impossible to have same measures, same inspections, same volume of notifications that we have bilaterally on a very, very well-defined issues. Like you obviously know that there are only 3 types of weapons that are covered by New START. So if we want to cover all types of nuclear weapons and nuclear delivery systems, if we want to go to multilateral formats, it is impossible to scale the procedures that are being done bilaterally. So we'll need to be flexible here. And actually, there are some things that can be called soft arms control. For example, Russian-Chinese notifications on missile and rocket launches. They are very specific. They have explicit directions, and this is basically like voluntarily data that is submitted by one side to another and vice versa. It's not like there are Russian inspectors monitoring the launch facility in China. It's basically just a piece of paper that are being delivered from the Chinese authorities to the Russian authorities, and nothing more. And it works. It helps, and I hope that this treaty will be alive soon, because it's also need to be extended, actually, like New START. So some other points that were mentioned by my colleagues on TPNW mentioned by Peter. I think that it is the TPNW itself might not be a really good thing in terms of finding solutions, but it is a perfect example to emphasize that we are in big trouble, that there is a big problems in the nuclear weapons related domains, and moreover there is a growing gap between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear states. And while currently this gap is mainly focused on the fact that nuclear weapon states do not want to give up their nuclear weapons and do not allow non-nuclear weapon states to get weapons of their own, I can foresee a future where these gaps appear in other domains, simply because, like, the non-nuclear weapon states might think that, like, you guys, you have your nukes and you don't want to do anything about that, then why should we work with you to find solutions for migration, for global warming, and things like that. It's not yet. We are not yet there, and I hope that we will continue a proper multilateral cooperation under UN auspices and so on. But I can see that with TPNW it's a shining sign that we have a problem of perception and of understanding between nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states. And speaking about non-nuclear capabilities mentioned by Peter, yes, I agree that it is important, and there is a notion that nuclear weapons are becoming a weapon for a poor country, because simply you have an opportunity to ensure your security with less weapons, with less investments, because modern precise guided long-range weapons are extremely expensive, and as I've mentioned, they require a lot of support infrastructure. So on the one hand, the development of, but this is one side of the problem. Another side is that with growing capabilities in non-nuclear deterrence, for example in Russia, we somehow we move the nuclear threshold further a bit, because Russian decision makers will be more confident in our non-nuclear forces, and probably US and NATO will be also understand that Russia has a non-nuclear capability to fight a conventional war, so conventional war won't be started. But there's the third problem. It's generally easier to make a decision to start a conventional war than to start a nuclear war. So yeah, it's very complicated. And on the issues of trust mentioned by Andrei, I'd emphasize that I agree that we need to manage current competition, and it is like a most important thing now than search for new solutions, not to get ourselves killed, absolutely. But by such management, it is crucial to achieve not only like symmetry of arsenals somehow, or parity of arsenals, but also parity of perception. I believe many people in this room know that there is this. Many U.S. decision makers and officials are very eager to claim that Russia is a power in decline, while China is a growing power. So there is no need to address any Russian concerns. Russia will soon dissolve anyway, and all the weapons will be rust, and so on. Just wait a little bit. Well, the events of the last decade had shown that it's not the case, and this imparity of perception is probably one of the reasons that we are where we are. And that I'll stop. Sorry for consuming so much of your time.
Dmitry, thank you very much for your excellent contribution, which gives me an opportunity to bridge several questions and forward these questions to other participants. And then I will ask you to join, and I have collected 3 questions already concerning what you have just said. So, actually, Nadezhda started to talk about the importance of the civil society and NGO efforts in raising awareness about the threat of nuclear war and how important it was during the Cold War period. Actually, we have today with us the members of 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners organizations, IPPNW and Pugwash, Conferences on Science and World Affairs, who did a lot in raising awareness about the nuclear risk and other issues in the realm of international security and peace. And I would like to ask Peter and Sergey Borisovich maybe to expand a little bit more about Gorbachev-Reagan statement, because I guess this is an excellent example of how civil society carefully tailored this awareness about the rising risks of nuclear war, and then the understanding of the risk of nuclear war was expressed on an official level by the 2 leaders of 2 countries which possessed the greatest arsenals of nuclear weapons at that time. And now we can hear that such statement could be made again in different formats, bilateral or maybe multilateral, and it could help a lot to find some solutions either in the realm of as Dmitry said, soft arms control or hard arms control, so that might be helpful. So could you please, Sergey Borisovich and Peter, expand a little more? Maybe you can spend 3-4 minutes on that, and then I will ask questions about hypersonic and arms control to Dmitry again.
Yeah. Am I the Peter you are aiming at? Peter Buys here.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, there were several questions already raised to me about TPNW and about how to build bridges and raising trust. Briefly about TPNW, I mentioned it already in the medical appeal, that it would be a great step forward, and also the working out of that medical appeal that the Dutch, as the only NATO country, joined the negotiations in New York. We are supporting the TPNW not as the ultimate silver bullet, but as a new pressure tool on the nuclear armed states to do their job and to fulfill their obligations. And when it entry into force after the 50th ratification, are now on 45. But we were placed for a dilemma by the new government, center right wing, who was absolutely against the TPNW, but said in his declaration, we actively pursue a nuclear weapon-free world. So our civil coalition chose to push on that button and leave the TPNW not out, but not in the center of our activities. And we came a long way. But when we had our Peace Palace event in November last year, organizing it together with the government to give them a push in the right direction, we negotiated that Beatrice Finn, as the ICANN director, would be one of the speakers there, and Sergey Batzanov witnessed that was the case. So there's a continuing debate, and we're saying that the narrative of NATO is, and the nuclear weapon state, that the TPNW undermines the NPT. But our reasoning is that the origin of this movement is humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons movement. Is just that because there's no action on Article 6, that was the push to start this movement. And what would really undermine the NPT would that the nuclear weapon states keep on not doing anything on Article 6. And that would really undermine, I'm afraid, NPT. About trust and building bridges, I think that is extremely important. And well, I invite every country to make use of their medical people to pay a contribution to that, because we have experienced by organizing also this Peace Palace event as a platform for many voices for a nuclear free world. We build bridges, and one of the consequences is this day of this forum, this part of the forum. Because Sergey Batzanov, if I may say, loudly said that he very much liked the Peace Palace dialogue model, a way to start at least discussion and to listen to each other and to hear the other one's position. As medical doctors, it's our daily bread and butter, but I agree with many people who say, well, the nuclear weapon states especially are not talking to each other in the right way. Although they came up with a statement in February where I was surprised that it was still something. Well, took too little time to go into that. The lack of interest of elites. I think that's another point where in Holland, at least, we made progress to formulate appeals and actively ask leading figures from the elite in our country to support it. And they did. Far out of their reach, a director of the biggest bank in Holland, he said, it's actually not my cup of tea. I'm not allowed to. But I think this is such an important thing. I agree with your appeal. And we are continuing to do it because we, for example, know that the Vietnam War in the US was finally start to end when the elite in the US realized that it was a lost game. So the position of the elites, we can influence, and as medical doctors, we have a good entrance and a good starting point, together with other organizations like the churches, the Red Cross, etc., etc. And coming to the Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev quote, I think the quote meant here is that a nuclear war cannot be won and should therefore never be fought. I witnessed during the PrepCom last year in New York that especially the USA was not anymore capable to say yes to this statement. Minister Lavrov of Foreign Affairs of your country clearly made clear in this interview, in fact, Argumenti, that he still does. And I think this is such a common sense, you would say, that we are considering with our international relations, with IPNW, ICANN, UPWASH, etc., to start maybe a big action with this one-liner, nuclear war cannot be fought and should never be won and should never be fought, because it's a very strong statement. And the end of the Cold War, on the one hand, I was not young enough, I was there, and the biggest demonstration ever held in Holland, more than 500,000, and the million in New York was also still the biggest demonstration there. That it needs public opinion pressure, and it needs leaders, of course, like in those days Gorbachev and Reagan, and it needs arguments and how we can reinvent this kind of combination to develop pressure on the leaders of the nuclear weapon states in these days. And then that means we have to find common ground for all of us, also for the nuclear weapon states. And one of the common grounds could be that no nuclear weapon states can guarantee that nothing went wrong, not intended, but unintended by technological or human failure. That cannot be excluded. And also a small regional nuclear war, let's say Pakistan, India, they're openly threatening each other with nuclear weapons. That would cause so much soot in the atmosphere that the temperature will go down several degrees. Scientific research proves this, that it will have harvest loss in a huge scale, and it will cost 2 billion people their life. So we have to look for common grounds, I think, and to make connections between the rival countries on civil society level to do our part of what must be done to prevent the worst thing that could happen. And COVID-19 can be helpful in a way to demonstrate that COVID-19 is so disruptive for all countries in all aspects of life, but that will be peanuts compared with a nuclear war or a nuclear detonation, and there will be no help at all. So, and the only difference with COVID-19 is that we exactly know what to do to prevent a nuclear war. We have to obey to Article 6 and to find ways to get rid of those nuclear weapons. Enough, I think, too much, but
thank you.
For so far.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was an excellent contribution, and I'm now facing a very difficult challenge because I have collected so many brilliant questions from the students who are watching our stream, and I have questions from Russia, from Latin America, from China, because I see that students have connected to join us. So, before I give the floor to Nadezhda to ask a couple of questions that she's now summarizing to make one more general question, let me make a follow-up question. Maybe Sergey Borisovich and Piotr will join, or other commentators would like to comment as well. This is a small follow-up question from a student from Latin America. She is raising the problem of correlation between the importance and the influence of efforts of civil societies and the nuclear policy of non-democratic states, so to say, and the tools of influence of civil society and, so to say, non-democratic states are limited. And as an expert, how could you explain what civil society can do and what are other channels of framing the visions and influencing the attitude towards nuclear war threat and the issues of nuclear deterrence? Sergey Borisovich, could you please start, maybe?
Yes, but I would. as, let's say, point of procedure. Anastasia Alexandrovna.
Yes, before, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. The student who asked the question was from Philippines, so not Latin America. I know that Latin America is also watching us, but that was the question that came from Philippines. Sergey Boris, you had the question about the procedure, yes?
Yes, it's not a question, small suggestion. Maybe it would be better if Nadezhda collects, I don't know, 2 or 3 questions with, I don't know, some small editing, and then you or Nadezhda would just throw it onto us, this as a package, and then we would try to address the substance in those questions. Now, since you gave me the floor, I had several points, actually, at this stage to make observations. One is, let's say, the future of nuclear weapons. There is, of course, a point of view, and not without reason, that sooner or later, and that happens probably, or that had happened in the past, with a number of types of weapons and systems of weapons, that with further development of technology and its applications in the military area, weapons do become outdated and less useful factually or even in terms of perception. And perceptions, of course, continue to play a very important role in what people think and what they ultimately decide. I mean, those who do decide about nuclear weapons. It seems to me, actually, that there is already a trend towards diminishing the role of nuclear weapons. For example, if you take Russian, let's say, military doctrinal phraseology, we are already talking, and sometimes, not every time, differentiating between nuclear and non-nuclear strategic deterrence. So this is our relatively recent contribution to, our, meaning very important military decision makers, to the discourse. So something is moving in that sense. The problem is that since we are in a transitional period in many respects, and transitional period, political, geopolitical, technological, and military, in many respects brings additional elements of instabilities. And when all that is not, especially when all that is not properly understood, that means additional risks. And since we still have nuclear weapons, the 9 nuclear possessor states in the world, there's always a risk of something happening and some weapon being used. And unfortunately, it's a kind of weapon that just one use, one explosion could be enough for a chain of irreversible events. And so I don't think we can rely on this technological progress to sort out the fate of nuclear weapons and making them obsolete, as some decades ago, the same President Reagan, already quoted by Peter Baus, was considering. But he thought that nuclear weapons would become obsolete due to space strategic defense initiative, meaning ballistic missile defense. Now, it didn't happen like that, and so far, the progress in strategic defense initiative, although it is called, of course, differently now, not as in the times of President Reagan, was one of the reasons that indeed increased, in my view, the chances for nuclear weapon use. Again, accidental, by mistake, or intentional. Which, in my view, is another reason to think wider than just when you sit in a purely nuclear box. This is the time of integration of more factors affecting strategic stability. Some of those factors are hard factors, meaning weapons themselves, but the increasing role is being played by softer factors, not necessarily weapons themselves, but systems that are on the periphery of weapons and warfighting, but nevertheless are increasingly supporting warfighting, like communications. And then there comes also artificial intelligence. And here a comment inspired by what Peter said about Colonel Petrov, who was sitting in front of his screens and his computers, and who finally concluded that the perceived threat was not the US missile attack on the Soviet Union, and acted accordingly. Now, an additional danger that we have now, and that is related to a number of new factors, is that time for decisions, time for people like Petrov, for much higher level people like the head of the country, or his or hers, maybe, closest advisors, that time frame is getting smaller, smaller, and smaller. And the field for uncertainty is getting larger and larger. On the one hand, the hypersonic missiles can play a role here because they fly rather fast. Now, I'm not going to go into details of hypersonic weapon systems because some of them do not fly actually faster than old, good intercontinental ballistic missiles, but in any case, they may add uncertainty. Cruise missiles certainly would do that. So the time may be shrinking. And much also depends on the deployment, on where these missiles are deployed. Another element here, so there is less and less time to think and to take good decisions. If, and there is, I think, a serious risk of such decisions being gradually, but at some point it may be almost completely, outsourced to artificial intelligence that allows to digest a huge amount of pieces of information. Then what? The artificial intelligence would decide on whether to start a nuclear war or not. Probably so. And that would be quite tragic. So we need to start thinking about antidotes. And the question, or rather the suggestion that, for example, new missiles like hypersonics should not carry nuclear warheads, and by the way, this is in arms control terms, I would say it's a verifiable proposition, but that would not necessarily help a lot because the risk would still remain. And because the window would have become so narrow, it would be difficult to sort out whether it's nuclear or non-nuclear. And as I already said, the thinking develops in the direction that non-nuclear systems can play a strategic deterrence role. So even in a non-nuclear attack, country X can be afraid, really afraid, of losing its main deterrent capabilities, or command and control capabilities. So therefore, you need to actually look at a wider range of issues in order to address the problem of nuclear threats today. And I'm afraid that even in the civil society globally, that fact or that issue is not substantially appreciated or not substantively enough. Well, I think I've been talking for too long. Let's proceed with other questions.
Yes, Sergey Borisovich, thank you very much for this contribution. And we have 14 minutes left before the end of our session. The list of questions is very long and it is increasing. So I will now ask Nadezhda to summarize and give some questions, and we will see how we can answer them. But my suggestion is, and thank you, Dmitry, for sharing this brilliant idea with me, my suggestion is that we will collect all the questions and we will address them to the experts, and we will give the experts opportunity to write the answers, and we will post the answers so that everyone will have the answers to their questions. Thank you, and now Nadezhda, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mulligan. So I'll try to ask questions as fast as I can. So the first question is related to the nuclear weapon-free zones. So as we all know, the nuclear weapon-free zones require cooperation from the nuclear weapon states, and not all of them has signed the existing protocols. And the question is, what are the possible solutions to address this issue? And what will be the consequences of the possible possession of nuclear weapons by the South Africa? Another question is related to the arms control. And should the nuclear weapon should be nuclear weapon states and states non-signatories to the NPT be included into the process of arms control? And one more question is tax control regime for defunding nuclear apparatus is a logical way forward for pressure groups on disarmament?
Can anyone identify who would be the first to answer? Sergey Borisovich, I see you are raising the hand. So may you start then?
Yes, I would, very briefly. Non-nuclear weapon-free zones, great achievement, but doesn't solve the problem globally. The problem with some of the nuclear weapon states not signing or ratifying additional protocols, it does exist. I don't think it is among the top, let's say, risks for nuclear stability, to put it cynically, but the work should continue, well, politically, diplomatically, that's it. South Africa had been a nuclear possessor state. In the bad old days, it mastered the nuclear fuel cycle and the technology of producing nuclear bombs. There were not many, but there were. It is so far the only nuclear possessor state which itself decided to get rid of nuclear weapons. And it did. It was connected with the end of apartheid regime and the great changes in South Africa, leading to majority rules. It took some time to dismantle the arsenal, and even longer time for the IAEA, including, to verify the results of dismantlement. But it's not a nuclear weapon state, and I don't see how it can be again. But it's a brilliant example. And then I would ask others to continue. I don't know who would volunteer.
I would like to see the hands. If you would like to join and continue answering, just signal me somehow that I can give you the floor. If there are no other suggestions to proceed with comments, then I will. Sergey Borisovich?
Yeah, yes, I forgot one more point. Involvement of non-nuclear weapon states in negotiations. Actually, I think it's quite possible. There is in theory, but in practice it's much more difficult to make proposals about that. In theory, there is conference on disarmament. Its number one agenda item is nuclear weapons. It has other items related to nuclear disarmament, and it is composed of all five so-called recognized nuclear, well, actually all the possessors are there in any case, and a considerable number of non-nuclear weapon states. If it is allowed to start working, you would have a group of nuclear possessors and non-possessors. But after the conclusion of the Treaty on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban by that same conference, and that was in 1996, the conference cannot do a single thing in terms of negotiations, in terms of agreeing on the program of work. Sometimes it agrees, but then soon thereafter disagrees again, and so on and so forth. It makes sense to involve non-nuclear weapon states in some way, but it has to be, let's say, engineered rather carefully. That is also possible. But first, I think that there should be a political will on behalf of or among nuclear weapon states to move ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey Borisovich. Now I will give the floor to Nadezhda, and she will summarize a few questions.
Thank you. So the question is the following. Is it possible to provide credible non-proliferation basis of hypersonic missiles under the MTCR regime?
Dmitry, I guess this is a question for you. Can you spend 2-3 minutes for answering this question?
Sure. I know that MTCR is becoming more and more involved into hypersonic weapons challenges. I know that during the latest plenary, actually that was almost a year ago, in New Zealand, results of a workshop or tabletop exercise that took place in Geneva a year ago also, last September, were presented to the MTCR board. And MTCR is very interested into addressing this new issue. And actually, it is very important to understand that hypersonic weapons, and there are several types of those, are evolutionary developments of the weapons that already exist. So they have all the parts, and they match the definitions, more or less match the definitions that are already in the MTCR guidelines. So it's not that complicated, and there are two sides to this issue. On the one hand, well, hypersonic weapons are not that different from other missiles, but as they are more hyped about, more popular, and everyone talks about them, then it is a good chance to use this opportunity to have more professional, more technical discussions about the issues of missile proliferation, missile threats as a whole, without addressing specifically hypersonic stuff. I think I'll stop here, and I think I did answer the question.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Dmitry, very much. I have excellent question from Columbia, from a student, the first-year student of Strategic and Arms Control Studies Master Program. She's now in Columbia, but she's watching us. But I will ask this question next session when we will discuss the future of NPT regime. The question relates to the situation in the Middle East. That's why now I will close the session for Q&A, and I will try to address some of the questions next 2 hours. After 30 minutes break, we will have the next session that will be dedicated to the discussion of the future of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I invite all join us and keep tuned and watch our discussion. Now, I would like to open the floor to everyone, to all the speakers and commentators of this session. If you would like to share some final remarks, takeaways, please, you're welcome.
Just. Can I start with that?
Yes, Peter, please. Of course, Peter, over to you.
Yes. In the first place, I want to mention that the Dutch government has, to our surprise, said in their latest statements to the parliament that they want to not replace the nuclear bombs we have in our country from the US, replaced by new ones, but instead of that, want, how difficult that may be, start negotiations with Russia and with our allies to look for ways to get Europe rid of every substrategic nuclear weapon from, say, from the Atlantic to the Urals. And even because the tensions are higher and higher, it's even, they say, it is all the more urgent to attempt in any way to start negotiations. That's an important signal. I hope it will be picked up by other NATO countries while these US weapons are discussed and will be taken up by Russia. And a final remark from my side, from the medical point of view, given the risk we are exposed to every day, any day, things will go wrong, that from the medical profession, we can learn that when there is an urgent situation caused by an underlying condition, that we first have to take emergency measures to keep the patient alive, and translate it to this nuclear weapon issue that could be no first use by President candidate Biden also approach, and by the Soviet Union done for a long time. The no first use, de-targeting, de-alerting, and other acute measurements to prevent that things go suddenly completely wrong, and in order to create time to solve the underlying problem being the nuclear weapons itself, because I'm afraid we cannot afford to wait until they are outdated or getting obsolete. I hope that will stay soon, but we really have to act. That's the core message from the medical point of view to the politicians.
Thank you, Peter. Andrei Baklitsky would like to add something like a takeaway or summarizing remark.
Yes, thank you so much. We had a very rich discussion. It's a very comprehensive discussion. It's hard to add much. I would just say that since the topic of our session was evolution of threat of nuclear war in the context of growing multipolarity, and we did not talk much about the multipolarity itself, I would just want to add that it is true that we have much more countries in play now, and we should take that into consideration, and we should really start thinking about how to deal with those issues. China has been raised a lot by the United States. Russia has been raising the participation of France and United Kingdom. And there were some good questions asked, including today, that what do we do with countries which are out of non-proliferation treaty, which are not formal possessors of the nuclear weapon states, but nevertheless have them on their territory. And we should really think about and talk about it more, maybe starting with more theoretical discussions, with scholarly discussions, and probably trying to start with the issues we have at hand and not with the formats at the beginning. So if we decide that we have a problem with X and those 3 countries are relevant, then maybe we should engage the 3 countries. If the 9 countries are relevant, you can think about that. If the 4 countries are relevant. So I would suggest to start thinking about it going from the point of what do we really care about and what are the problems we are facing, and then talking about the format in which we can address those. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. We have only 5 minutes left before the end of this session, so I would like to ask Pyotr Topechkanov, Sergey Borisovich, and Dmitry Stepanovich maybe to give a couple of sentences just to spend no more than 1 minute each. Pyotr, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I would like to thank you and the organizers of this discussion. This discussion is a good example that we can hear each other and we can have the same language, even if the panelists may have with different backgrounds. And for me, as a good lesson for the decision makers, I can give you a short example. When Russia offered to have a non-deployment commitment for medium-range missiles after the death of the INF Treaty, this opportunity was missed by the European countries because this invitation wasn't taken by European countries. So even if this opportunity was missed, I think that it can be used again for having a discussion about medium-range missiles in Europe between Russia, NATO, and other European countries. And we have many other proposals and suggestions on the table that can be discussed between decision makers and representatives of the public organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Pyotr. Dmitry, would you say a few words, please?
Yeah, I'm actually grow on what was said in the last comments by my colleagues. Actually, Europe is the region where non-nuclear weapon states can be a part of nuclear arms control. As Peter pointed out, there is quite a push in the Netherlands to do something with legacy nuclear gravity nuclear bombs that are staged there. They are staged in several other European countries, and while we are told that it is more of a political thing rather than military thing, those are quite an issue in terms of security for Russia. And as on the other hand, there is a demand from the US, and we can understand them, that future nuclear arms control should address Russian tactical or strategic nuclear weapons or whatever that is not currently addressed by the New START. So this is where non-nuclear weapon states in Europe can be a very, very important player. And so my last point would be that to raise awareness about issues related to nuclear weapons is of paramount importance these days. So great project that we're having here right now. And also, as I mentioned, TPNW contributes to that. And even this great document issued by the Donald Trump administration in the US, the Nuclear Posture Review in 2018, while it has many problems, it actually contributed to a greater attention, greater interest in the nuclear weapons domain, because it really looks like that many people, including people behind the doomsday clock, believed that nuclear weapons problems will solve themselves without any active participation. And over the last few years, over the last decade, I think everyone understood that they remain an important part of the picture, and we have to work hard to find solutions.
Dmitry, thank you very much. Sergey Borisovich, as a moderator of this session, I ask you to sacrifice your 30 seconds for very important announcement. I know that the participants and organizers of this forum made a lot to outreach the celebrities and decision makers, and the prominent, world-known conductor and musician maestro Valery Gergiev is sending his best regards for this forum. He sent me via WhatsApp messenger a video record of his welcome remarks. Unfortunately, it came just when we already started the discussion, so I hope I will be able to broadcast these welcome remarks during the next session that will happen in 30 minutes. And please join us in thanking all the participants, the speakers, the commentators, and the interpreters of this session. Thank you very much, and we need to wrap up now. Thank you, and we are closing. Goodbye.